Season's greetings, everyone. It's the 9th of December, and it's time to open up another window on the TooFatLardies Advent Calendar for 2023. And behind this window is the question: what aspect of warfare do you think is the most difficult to model, and how do you feel you've overcome that, and possibly where do you think there's more to do? In writing a set of wargaming rules, some aspects of the combat which you're trying to replicate always seem to me to be very challenging. Absolutely at the top of that is the wargaming of combats which are taking place at night. Fighting in the dark has been a feature of warfare throughout all time, and that's because night gives some key advantages to the combatants but also poses a particular set of challenges. So for the attacker, the advantage of night actions is that they can bring surprise. There's a reduced visibility to the template of the attacking forces. A night always offers the attacker the ease of escape after the combat has achieved its objectives. For the defender, there's different challenges. Most obviously, perhaps, the fact that they may be surprised and not in a good posture for defending their position when the action starts. And there's also the risk of chaos and mayhem as a defence is attempted to be organised in the worst possible circumstances. But I've been thinking a little bit about this during the course of a couple of years, really, because I've always felt that the rules for night fighting, while they may be perfectly serviceable in every set of rules that we look at, I just wonder if something hasn't quite been captured which is particular to a night action. Perhaps the starting point in that journey relates to figuring out what we're trying to replicate in a night action. I think there's some merit in thinking of night action as being an environment which has to be captured in every single rule in the set of wargaming rules that you're playing at the moment, so that night action isn't just a detached couple of lines or paragraphs at the end of the set of rules which somehow inhibits control. Night is an environment which brings challenges throughout all of the different aspects of the conflict. So all of the different wargaming rules need to be considered in the context of the night action. Some may change, but not all of them. And possibly the way to think through that is getting to the point that one thinks of night as being an environment where all of the control is subject to being potentially reduced. So the lack of visibility is a feature of that, but it's not the only thing. There's a clear difficulty of coordination. There's a possible fragmentation of command. There's also the aspect of surprise, particularly if one of the sides has no preparation at all for the combat which is about to take place. So all of those are contributing to the environment in which all of the different rules for movement, for firing, for command and control need to be examined. I find those aspects quite difficult to model because one's looking through each one of the rules and thinking, how does the environment of night affect each one of those particular rules? And when I've played night actions, I have just wondered whether adding visual penalties or movement restrictions really threaten to penalise the players for doing things on the table that they'd normally enjoy. They normally enjoy moving the figures around, effectively coordinating their forces. Once you introduce night as an environment for the wargame to take place, the risk is that you're really penalising the players as regards the efficiency of their forces without necessarily creating something else. And one example of that would be where one side has an advantage in the night action. So a good example might be, a very familiar example might be Japanese naval power, especially in the lighter forces with, say, Japanese destroyers approaching American forces at Guadalcanal down the slot. A clear example of one force which has really extensively trained for a night action in the period between the two world wars. But when one builds in forces like that, is it the case that that's fine for one player, but not for the other? Is that really sort of capturing some of the dynamics of history, But what sort of game does that create for one of the players around the table? I think potentially in wargaming night actions, we might be missing a trick. One of the aspects I think relates to the visual aspects of the game. We play our war games usually in daylight, or at least where there's illumination. That's always been one of the things that, it's a very personal thing, but I always find slightly difficult about night actions. They just don't look quite right with a fully illuminated table and normally painted figures. One of the crazier ideas I have is to try and create a wargaming table, it'd probably be a small one, in which the terrain and the figures are painted appropriately for a night action. That doesn't mean to say everything's just painted black, but there are elements which could be brought out in how you'd visualise a wargaming table which is taking place at night, with areas of the table which are illuminated and areas which are not. That's one aspect. Perhaps a slightly crazy one, but that's just me. But that is one aspect that I think would help me to visualise the environment of night in a way that possibly hasn't always been done. But I think there's also a narrative element to a night action, which I'm not sure the wargaming rules that we have really quite captured. So any movie or theatre director would tell you about the heightened drama of darkness. Things are just more dramatic. They're more exciting. They're inherently more dangerous. And there's some possibility for the rules that we use on the wargaming table to try and capture that deadliness. How does that translate onto the table? I mean, you've got the drama of some of the environments. Monmouth's night march to the Royal Army at Sedgemoor, for instance, or paratroopers landing near a German radar station, or duelists in a Venetian masquerade, if you want to be completely extreme about it. But there again, when you've got the war game on the table, you're seeing everything in daylight, in a bright room. And if the war game rules simply reduce the effectiveness of the combatants around the table by challenging their command, control, and increasing the risk of accidents and blunders on the table in the chaos of a night environment, some of the drama isn't really there, because what's happening on the war games table is inefficiency, whereas for the game, what you really want is a heightened sense of excitement, a heightened sense of the environment and the danger of night. It's a real contrast between war games rules which replicate night engagements through a downgrade and a set of war games rules which attempt to make the game exciting and bring its own particular attraction as a war game in itself. I think there's a real opportunity to think through those aspects and try and infuse night combat on the war games table, not just with a lack of control, but also with elements of the danger, the tension, the opportunity and the sheer terror that contemporaries in historical accounts write about when they're describing night action. So how do we solve those complex questions and the challenge which Richard and Nick have set me? I think partly it's in thinking about and describing the setting in which the game's taking place, thinking about rules which cover holistically all of the different aspects of the wargame environment in which the combat's been set. And I think it's a question of trying to create rules that don't just reduce command and control, which don't just reduce the potential fun around the table, but also rules which really augment and give something to the players which reflects the particular characteristics of a night action, but also give the game a lot of flavour and make it an environment in which people actively want to look to try and recreate the historical combats of the past which took place at night.